Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in again to What Does That Piece Do? My name is Joe. This is a follow-up video to my previous video on the game Comancheria by GMT Games. In that I discussed what my thoughts were on the game, gave my personal input and review, and also talked a little bit about Indigenous storytelling and who gets to tell the stories about Native people. Since then, the designer has actually responded to me. I actually reached out to him in advance just to see if I can get his input on some of the things I was going to talk about. I did finally hear back from him after the video was released, so Joel Toppen has responded with his insight on what his thought process was in designing the game, and some specific responses to the idea of, a white man being able to tell the story of Indigenous peoples in a time where we're looking for more and more Indigenous people to be able to tell their own story. He gave some very thoughtful responses that I think are worth exploring, including one point that might be a little bit of a place for healthy disagreement between us, but I think it's just worth discussing. But I really do appreciate his input on that, so I'm glad to address all those points. But first off, something I should have done last time. I let you all know that I'm coming to you from Takaranto, known as Toronto, which in Mohawk means where there are trees standing in the water. Today, Takaranto is covered under Treaty Number 13 and the Williams Treaties. It is the traditional territories of many First Peoples, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and Wendat peoples. This territory is part of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum, a treaty made between the Anishinaabe Mississaugas and the Haudenosaunee, where nations entered into an agreement to protect the land and responsibly care for its resources in harmony together. So, probably should have started that last video off with that bit of a land acknowledgement to talk about what piece of land I'm sitting on right now. Another thing I should have mentioned as well is some of the books that I've been reading on this topic, but it's actually a good thing because since then I've had a week off, had a vacation, had a lot of reading that I got through, which is great, reading a lot of books on this topic specifically. And I had started reading, when I first started playing this game, I had started reading Empire of the Summer Moon by S.C. Gwynne, which I didn't get all the way through it. I only got a couple chapters into it. I thought it was really good. It's very focused on Cynthia Ann Parker. She's mother of Quanah Parker. Cynthia Ann Parker was a white captive of the Comanche who really took to the Comanche peoples. She was, welcomed as one of their own and didn't even want to leave that culture ultimately, even when they, when she was tried to be rescued. People tried to rescue her from the Comanches. She had pretty much forgotten English, and this is a bit of her story. Pretty good. It got to a point where some of the language being used, there's a lot of reference to the savages, and I don't know if it's just trying to use the vernacular and terminology of the people or the historians at the time, but that got a little grating to a certain point. But I think I need to just dust that off and revisit that book at some point. What I did read a lot of on my time off was Indigenous Continent by Pekka Hämäläinen. It's very good, very in-depth overview of pretty much all the contacts between settlers and the indigenous of North America throughout the centuries. It's kind of like a play-by-play almost. It lists so many different nations. I couldn't keep track of them all, but it tries to center the story on a handful of the nations, including Comanche. I read most of that, but I kind of had to skip ahead to the part about the Comanche. My loan was running out from the library, but a really great telling of those stories. I've now started The Earth is Weeping by Peter Cozzens. It's a very good intro to, starts off with the chiefs that met Abraham Lincoln in Washington before going home to their homelands and being persecuted further by white settlers. So a really interesting contrast on, how this is all developed over North America over the centuries and how there's a lot of contrast between contacts between people. I was also listening to the audiobook of The Heartbeat of Wounded Knee by David Treuer, who's an Indigenous writer. So all the other writers are non-Indigenous, but this is from David Treuer. He talks about the legacy after that notable massacre at Wounded Knee and how the Indigenous people have continued to fight for their rights after that, in a century after, and also just how some people are living today. So again, talking more about that lived experience and what does that mean for Indigenous that are coping with that past trauma and how are they just moving on. Really cool. Got through most of that, but I didn't get through all of it. I got to get that book back out again. But I also got a chance to watch Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. I didn't read the book, but I watched the HBO TV movie from 2007, I believe. Pretty good, actually. It's kind of long, not too long compared to some movies today, but it's got a very TV movie vibes in some respects. Some bit of cheesiness, but some of the action in there, like when things actually went down in some of these conflicts. It's actually pretty dramatic and pretty well done, I thought, in a lot of cases. But a pretty good telling of the story overall. Again, the Dawes Act that was coming into place and how people were being put onto reservations and things like that. So I think it's definitely worth a watch. I enjoyed that. I'm pretty deep into this topic right now. Like when I got home again from my vacation away for a week, I set the game up again so I could play it again, and then took the time to think about how I wanted to follow up this video, especially taking into consideration Joel's responses. So like I said, Joel, I reached out to him, the designer of the game. I'd reached out before I even recorded the video, just with my notes of what I was going to talk about. He didn't get a chance to get back to me until afterwards, so there's a good reason to follow up with this. So when we talk about a game being designed by a white man, specifically a white man associated with the church, telling the story of Native people, he also says, well, to that I would have to add that you also have a war game designed by a military historian who also happens to be both a pastor and a pacifist. What can I say? I'm complicated. So I can appreciate that, absolutely. We're not one-dimensional beings. There's a lot to us. There's a lot that we can bring to something like a game design and whatnot, and I truly believe that he did here. But specifically, when we're talking about, this is someone associated with the church and their unhealthy history in North America with Indigenous people. Like that's a bit of a call-out. But that's why he says here, what was done in the past is a big reason why I've chosen to do what I'm doing with the one life I get to live. And I can absolutely appreciate and respect that. Again, the church, their contact with natives over the years here in North America, it's had its ups and downs. There was some, good intentions along the way, but ultimately we end up with things like residential schools in Canada and the US, where we now have graves of children that were taken away from their families to be brought up in these residential schools that were administered by the church. And there's enough children that died at these schools to have mass graves. So think about that. But obviously I believe he recognizes that, and there's a lot to sort of, reconcile for here, and that seems to be what Joel's doing. But when it comes down to who gets to tell the story, what right does a white man have to tell the story of natives when we've been the ones telling the story for hundreds of years now, and that's a lot of the sources we have? Well, this is what he had to say. I chose to tell the story of the Comanche because they formed a big part of the history of the Navajo. Not having first-hand access to any Comanche people proved the biggest design challenge. I eventually was able to have some conversations while visiting their museum in Oklahoma, but there was precious little that I could find that was written by Comanche people themselves. So I told the story the best I could with what I had. And it's just an example of, we don't have some of this history written by the people necessarily. And so obviously he's basing this game as kind of a continuation after Navajo Wars, which he has a little bit more affiliation with the Navajo people, I believe. So that was really his form of reference originally, and then looking into the Comanche people more, I really honestly thought there was a game there, and there absolutely is. But when I go on to say, I would like to see games like this designed by Indigenous folks, to which he says, well, I hope my two games, Navajo Wars and Comancheria, will get the ball rolling. And I truly believe they do. Obviously, there is a market for these types of games, so we hope to see more narratives like this. I do anyway, and I think a lot of others would agree. When it gets right down to it, I kind of pose the question I ask myself, is it okay to enjoy a game designed by a white man telling the Indigenous story? And to this he had to say, I have intentionally left the telling of the culture somewhat vague in both my game designs. Why? Out of respect. I had a number of discussions about this with Navajo friends. We concurred that it would be best to leave things somewhat vague and undefined, a very Navajo way. White people find this frustrating. I think you have to be Indigenous to get it. I thought that was very interesting. How stories are told in different cultures is different. How we receive them is different, and how we interpret them is different. So leaving some things vague, we can't get into the minutiae of the details because we don't have all the details. Some of it is passed down through oral history, not written history, so kind of have to fill in the blanks a little bit and use our imagination a little. But when I said I thought we could see more Indigenous terms, words, phrases maybe used in the game language here, and how some things are labeled, or maybe how they show up in the rulebook, he said, probably. I think by this point I was trying to stay consistent with my earlier word, Navajo Wars, which does incorporate more native terminology into the rules, but owing to the difficulty I had in obtaining native terms for the Comanche and not wishing to offend by using the wrong terms, something that happens way too often, I left well enough alone. So, fair enough. This is about, putting this into the war game space. Sometimes you just end up having to use the war game terminology of what that audience is familiar with, which seems to have done here. Now, the one point that's maybe a bit of a sticking point, or maybe I ruffled some feathers or phrased this the wrong way, but I did say I would like to see more Indigenous art being used in a game like this rather than more art from a white guy that isn't necessarily affiliated with Indigenous cultures. To which Joel said, I have to strongly object to this. I think the map for Navajo Wars perfectly fits the story. Comancheria's map too. What I didn't want was anything that was a caricature of the people. I think Domhnall nailed it with his artwork. So first off, want to say if that was taken, what I said was taken as a slag on Domhnall Hagerty's work, that was not my intention at all. So I want to call out the amazing work that Domhnall did on this, and just, Domhnall's portfolio overall. Like, let's look at some of the work he's done. Like, on top of Comancheria, he did Navajo Wars with Joel. He did Red Flag over Paris, one of the most beautiful boards that I've seen recently. Also Versailles 1919, another GMT game. Beautiful, excellent artwork. I love all this stuff. Field and Stone, Siege of Vienna. He's also done The Vote from Hollandspiel. And Dinosaur Gauge, so getting into even just some funnier non-history stuff, just some more fun work. And he's also got some other upcoming work with Unhappy King Charles and The Collapse. So obviously he's got a great portfolio, really well, speaks for itself really quite well. So this by no means was a slag on his work and his design here. My point that I was trying to make here is, like, Domhnall, as you see, he's got a great portfolio, a lot of war games for the most part. Like, he comes from a wargaming background too, I believe. I was just listening to a really good podcast, by the way, Dan Bullock's podcast, where he has a great interview with him, and he talks about his experience, which was quite fascinating. But yeah, it's very much still a wargame mentality of, like, this, decades and decades of sort of wargame design with his artistic flair put into this, but that's still kind of superimposed over this Indigenous story. So I do still think there is room to inject some actual Indigenous art into this. And so this is by no means to say, like, Joel, you shouldn't work with Domhnall anymore. I mean, he loves working with him, obviously, and they do some great work together. Like, I absolutely encourage that. I mean, I would personally love to see an Indigenous artist brought to the table to actually inject their design sense into this. But, like, when you think of it, I think that's the low-hanging fruit of how do we get Indigenous people's voices and ideas to this. It's like there's a lot of Indigenous artists and designers out there that, when probably some in the wargame space, I just haven't seen many names yet, but, like, when they are brought a canvas like this to paint upon, I think they could do some really amazing work and really inject some new ideas, not just into this game, but into the wargame space in general. So I think that would be great. And this isn't to take away any work from Domhnall. I mean, obviously we've seen he's getting a lot of work, which is great. I don't want to get stuck in this trap of, like, hey, let's replace someone that's very qualified with someone else as some sort of diversity hire. Like, that's not what this is about. But there could be potentially an opportunity for Domhnall or someone to mentor an artist that would be new to this space, so that we could see them showing up more and getting that sort of guidance they get from someone that is very experienced. So I wouldn't want to take any work away from him. If the next game that Joel does in this series, I hope this is a series. I think there's going to be more games on this realm, this topic from Joel. And if he's working with Domhnall, great. I'm still going to get that game. I'm still going to play it. I'm just saying what I would like to see and what I think would really move the hobby forward for more diversity of voices overall. So that was my input there. I mean, again, agree, disagree, but Joel, I do appreciate your feedback on that and being open and honest there. Ultimately, I want to thank Joel for taking the time to respond respectfully and having this open dialogue with me. I really hope he appreciates the video and even this follow-up as well, too, to highlight his games even more. I absolutely appreciate his passion, what he's done, what he's given to us. It's a brilliant design. This probably isn't the last you've heard from me on this game, or potentially Navajo Wars if I get my hands on that in the future. So For now, I hope you do get a chance to enjoy this game at some point, and we'll see you next time. Cheers.